I think there are some problems with the Western narrative on Ukraine, and I'm going to speak about that more than the Russian narrative because, let's face it, who of our viewers have really heard the Russian narrative? It's kind of off the airwaves at this point, I think.
Who really cares either, to be honest? It's
Exactly.
Like half the time at the moment on Russian TV, I see them threatening to nuke us, so it's just like, okay, well, that's normal.
Yeah, the Russian chat shows are just ridiculous hyperbole in all directions, but I think they've always been that way. Now, I'm not going to waste your time with the most extreme inaccurate speculations about the war because, quite frankly, there's already enough misinformation out there, but what I'm going to do is show a few accounts, some official and some well-trusted, and rely mainly on relatively well-trusted OSINT, or open source intelligence accounts that are relaying the conflict to both sides. As a result, these accounts and messages can be described as Western-leaning or Russian-leaning, but I think it would be a mistake to call them overtly pro-Western, pro-Russian or propaganda. And I think that's a distinction that's worth making. Particularly for Russian-leaning accounts, there is the tendency for them to get smited with the infamous Twitter ban hammer. There is genuine information war happening right now, after all. Now, before we get started, why is it important to talk about this? Well, let me tell you a story. Have you heard the apocryphal story of the Emperor of China?
Which one?
So, there are many. I cannot remember for the life of me where I heard this from, but I think it's pertinent to this case here. So the story goes that the Emperor of China is at war, and first of all, his armies defeat the enemy far away, and then they keep defeating them, and they carry on defeating them right up until he looks out of the window. The enemy army is already there, burning down the palace. And the story that you take away there, obviously, is that all of the advisors who just relay the stories that the emperor wants to hear end up feeding him a completely false picture of what's going on, and then if things turn against him, he gets a real nasty shock. So don't shoot the messenger, but I want to talk about some things which perhaps put a bit of a dampener on the overall very positive, very Ukraine is winning this war style messaging that we've been hearing for the last few weeks. So let's lean into the Western narrative. Russia's offensive has stalled in the east, and Ukraine is making gains around Kharkiv. From Jomini of the West here, a well-followed and reasonably good Western-leaning open source intelligence account. So, Ukraine, day 73 to 76, the past 100 hours has seen the Ukrainian military expand on the initial success of its limited counter-offensive around Kharkiv. Russia's offensive along the Seversky Donets line, which is a river, has generally stalled with limited successes in Popasna. So you read that, it's like, okay, great. The Ukrainians have got the Russians' number. Fabulous. Carry on with my day. We're going to go into more of his assertions. We're going to go through his whole story about what's happening, and then later on we're going to critique that. He continues, in Kharkiv, Ukraine's limited counter-offensive of the Kharkiv area, if we scroll down to the next tweet in the thread, continues to make solid progress. Russian forces have been pushed into a thin strip of territory averaging only 10 kilometers in depth. This OD is in danger of collapsing, similar to the Kiev and Sumy fronts. That's even better. Like, fabulous. He continues, the Ukrainian General Staff estimates Russia only has 3 battalion tactical groups of very poor quality remaining in this area. However, Ukrainian intelligence reports that Russia has at least 19 battalion tactical groups in the Belgorod area that may be preparing to counterattack towards Kharkiv. So this is all sounding quite good, right? Russia is collapsing. Yeah, they have some reinforcements in the vicinity, so there might be a counterattack. But generally speaking, Ukraine's offensive is going great. He continues to a new area of the conflict, Severodonetsk OD. Russian forces have managed to seize control of Popasna, Nizhny, and Velika Kormushav. I'm not even going to try. However, offensive efforts in other sectors of the Donbass remain stalled and ineffectual.
How many H's do you need? Like,
I know. Kormishuvaka, I think. But Russian forces may be preparing to shift priority of axis. So, okay, the Russians have made some gains, but they're not very significant, not very important, and mainly they're stalled and ineffectual. Zaporizhia OD, there has been little activity here over the past several days. Russian forces are focusing artillery and airstrikes in support of limited assaults on Orikhiv, Huilaipole, and Velika Novoshilka. No territory has changed hands recently, and that's true as far as I can ascertain. Azovstal, Mariupol still stands. Russian attacks resumed on the 8th of May with artillery and airstrikes supporting ground assaults. There are an estimated 1,000 Ukrainians defending it. As far as I can ascertain, that's also true. In Odessa and Kherson, there's been little activity in the Kherson-Odessa region. Missile strikes increase against Odessa while tensions remain high along the Moldova border as Russia attempts to fix Ukrainian forces in this area from being redeployed. Again, little activity, yep, that's true. Aerospace assessment. Russian Air Force sorties hold steady at 200 to 300 sorties in a 24-hour period. It's a lot of planes. A lot of bombs. Russian forces are strengthening their air defense network in Kherson, as well as in Izium, Seversky Donetsk line to better protect critical targets like command posts and supply points. So their air force is active, but he's implying that that's actually more of a defensive move, so it's not actually doing that much damage. Battle damage assessment. Russian forces in the Kharkiv OD are combat ineffective and unable to halt the Ukrainian advances. Now, that's quite a statement. In the Zaporizhia and Donbass ODs, there is indications that Russian units are severely demoralized and not obeying orders. Wow. We go to the next one here, and let's have a look at the map on number 12 here. So this is more of a broad map where you see some NATO deployments. That one there, yeah. The Kremlin holds steady to its current narrative during Russia's 9th of May Victory Day celebrations, which false flag activity in Moldova and along the northwest Belarus border will likely not expand the war beyond Ukraine. Western aid continues to accelerate. But generally speaking, you can just see you've got the refugee exodus marked there from Ukraine. You can see the blue boxes of the NATO forces arrayed along the borders there, as well as some information in the combat zone. And he carries on. This sounds amazing, honestly. Like, if this were true, you would think, okay, this war is not going to last long. The Ukrainians have amazingly managed to defeat the much larger Russian army, which must be so corrupt and so incompetent and blah, blah, blah. But I think a lot of this is basically hyperbole, very biased and misleading, sadly. So if one of them is this. So if we go to the next one, this is the evidence for him saying that the Russian troops are severely demoralized and combat ineffective in Kharkiv. It comes from the Pentagon and the usual unnamed US defense official. We all like US defense officials, don't we? Especially the unnamed ones who come out 20 times a day to pump information into our soft, squishy brains.
It's probably the same guy.
I do wonder. He must be permanently caffeinated, if so. But they continue here. During a background briefing, the senior official at the Department of Defense told Newsweek that the agency had received anecdotal reports of poor morale among Russian troops in Ukraine, as well as reports that Russian military officers had been disobeying orders. The US government official further characterized the Russian leadership on the ground as not being sound or in control. Okay, even better, right? They're just lunatics. They're not obeying orders. They've completely fallen apart. This war should be over this week, right? It sounds a bit too good to be true, I think.
Yeah, especially when even the source is saying it's just anecdotal evidence.
Yeah, the official added that the reports the department has received about Russian dissidents involved mid-grade officers, including some at the battalion level. He said that the reports indicated that some of these officers either refused to obey orders they were given or had not followed through with the orders to the level at which they had likely been expected to respond. The reports could not be independently confirmed. And I just want to make the point here that a huge amount of the evidence that OSINT channels take as gospel actually traces back to this anonymous Pentagon official or his many friends, citing unverifiable anecdotal evidence. Some have speculated that this means trusted OSINT channels are not in fact independent, but instead supported by national intelligence agencies. More likely, to my mind, is that they are predisposed to be sympathetic towards pro-Ukrainian messaging coming from the Pentagon, while dismissing the same type of information coming from the Kremlin as laughable propaganda. Now, I do think that a lot of the stuff coming from the Kremlin is laughable propaganda, but I think the double standard here does point to a bias which is driving these frankly misleading and inaccurate reports on what's happening in Ukraine.
But probably also something that everyone takes into account. Like, if you're a professional engaging in this sort of information war for national government, this is something you probably have in mind and also play into.
You would like to think so. You would like to think so, certainly. But if we look at some tweets from the Ministry of Defense here, I don't really know where to start on this, so I'll just read out what they have here. Fighting continues at Zmyny Island, also known as Snake Island, with Russia repeatedly trying to reinforce its exposed garrison located there. Ukraine has successfully struck Russian air defenses and resupply vessels with Bayraktar drones. Russia's resupply vessels have minimum protection. They've retreated to the Crimea after losing the Moskva. Its attempts to augment forces on Zmyny Island offer Ukraine more opportunities to engage Russian troops and attrit material. So, sounds amazing. Basically, Ukraine is kicking the Russians left, right, and sideways. But as far as I can ascertain, the fighting at Zmyny Island is basically a few airstrikes, a few drones.
I saw some footage. I mean, the reason I've not been saying much is because I just don't know much about this situation. But I did see some footage of them trying to land a helicopter with some more Russian reinforcements on the island,
yeah.
and it was just immediately blown up.
Right.
So, oh, great.
Yeah.
So,
But as far as I'm aware, there's no actual boots on the ground from Ukraine's side.
no, it just seems to be blowing up anything that arrives.
Exactly.
Or at least that's the footage I've seen.
Yeah, no, I've seen footage of that as well. It does, but there are conflicting narratives over what's actually happening at Snake Island. However, I think it's worth pointing out that Snake Island is fairly unimportant in terms of the number of people and assets deployed there compared to the entire front in the east of Ukraine.
It's just got meme value.
Yeah, so the fact that the Ministry of Defense saw fit to give an entire daily report just about this one speck of rock, it's what are they not telling you is more important than what they are. If we go to the next one I've found of theirs, so this is from yesterday. Russia's underestimation of Ukrainian resistance and its best-case scenario planning have led to demonstrable operational failings. So he wasn't able to announce success in the Victory Day parade. And I think they're right, saying that Russia's invasion plan is highly likely to have been based on the mistaken assumption it would encounter limited resistance and would be able to encircle bypass population centers rapidly. I think that's true, but that's not exactly news, right? That was, we knew that back in February, March. It's already May, right? And they're coming out with this. It's like, yes, we know this. This is not new. Okay. Why are you reporting on this? Again, it's what they're not telling you that's more important than what they are. And if we go to the next one, at the onset of its invasion of Ukraine, Russia publicly promoted its ability to construct surgical strikes and limit collateral damage. And there are two narratives that are being pushed here in this briefing. One of them is that Russia is indiscriminately targeting civilians, which is, first of all, a contradiction in terms, because if you're indiscriminate, then you're not targeting anybody, apart from that small pedantic point. If you're indiscriminately targeting someone, right, then that means you're probably hitting something else. Is that kind of vibe on it? Anyway, but then they're also saying that Russia's running out of precision-guided munitions because it's using dumb bombs, which are normal munitions and that sort of thing. And this is something, again, that's being pushed on the Western-leaning side of the information sphere, but I think a little bit suspect at this point. It might be true. If it is true, fantastic. Ukraine's got this in the bag. But I don't know, just putting together the picture of everything they're saying, every single piece of information seems to be pro-Ukraine, seems to be indicating that Ukraine has got this in the bag.
Well, I suppose that's what they pay to do as well. Something
Yeah.
to take into account. Although I don't know. Obviously, again, I'm not.
Yeah.
But I remember Laserpig talking about this, at least.
Mm-hmm.
Great source. He was mentioning the fact that the surgical weapons they have, the targeted weapons, just don't work because they all relied on the American GPS service. And that got turned off the moment they started the war.
Right.
So they're having to install little GPSs on their planes to even know where they're going.
Mm-hmm.
So never mind their actual weapons, which must be buggered. So it might even be that just, well, okay, these are useless. Let's go get the other weapons.
That would be quite surprising. I'll have to read up on that. But there are lots of these small technological things that you probably wouldn't know at the high command level, but actually have a big impact on your war. But whether these things are true or whether they're just narratives that are being injected into the public dialogue, I don't know. And finally, we have one from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office here. Putin saluted his forces in Red Square while Ukrainians sifted through the rubble of a school in Luhansk where 60 are feared dead. Contrary to Kremlin lies, Russian forces are indiscriminately targeting civilian infrastructure with this strike in Bilohorivka, the latest atrocity. I've got a few things to say here. So the first thing is, in Syria, the first place that the jihadis would take over when they came to a village was the school, for the very practical reason that it was usually the only concrete building there. Everything else would be much more primitive architecture. So if you're looking to hide in something that's defensible, you end up going to the schools. And so I would not be surprised if a similar thing is happening here, though, of course, I'm not saying that it is. The other thing is that Bilohorivka is on the front lines virtually in the East Donbass campaign. So the idea that there's shelling there is not surprising to me. These 60 feared dead, I obviously hope that they're not civilians. They may be. That's terrible. But these things do happen in
War
war.
is hell.
That's why at the Nuremberg trial it was decided that conducting an invasive war, an aggressive war, was the ultimate war crime in a sense, because war is just so bad, no matter how well you try to make it not so bad. Anyway, and one of the reasons I'm so skeptical about all of this information is this, because last month the US basically admitted that it was straight up lying about the war in Ukraine.
Okay, why?
Well, why indeed? So in a break with the past, the US is using intel to fight an info war with Russia even when the intel isn't rock solid. It doesn't have to be solid intelligence, one US official said. It's more important to get out ahead of them, the Russians, Putin specifically, before they do something. And I just found this amazing. It was an attention-grabbing assertion, they continue, that made headlines around the world. US officials said they had indications suggesting Russia might be preparing to use chemical agents in Ukraine. I remember this. You remember this. You at home remember this, I'm sure. President Joe Biden later said it publicly. But 3 US officials told NBC News this week there is no evidence Russia has brought any chemical weapons near Ukraine. They said the US released the information to deter Russia from using the banned munitions.
Okay. I mean, you can see the motive, but then you're just openly lying. And,
exactly.
Well, I mean, you're the US government, so we should expect that as well.
Right. This is just yet another reason not to trust these people. I'm sorry, if you're trying to work out what's actually happening. And when you're trusting intelligence sources that present everything really nicely and neatly with good graphics and maps and things, but then it turns out that they're just relying on unnamed Pentagon officials. Anyway. It's one of a string of examples, they continue, of the Biden administration's breaking with recent precedent by deploying declassified intelligence as part of an information war against Russia. The administration has done so even when the intelligence wasn't rock solid to keep Russian President Vladimir Putin off balance. And I just think that fundamentally, if your job is to provide information, then you're playing with fire when you're just deliberately lying to everyone, even if you're fighting this information war.
Well, it's not how the American government sees itself, of course, and perhaps it shouldn't either. You know, it's meant to be fighting an information war, not just telling the truth in regards to global conflicts. Although one where it's not officially involved.
Yeah, no, that's true.
Gets more money.
But let's go back to talk about Western OSINT, open source intelligence. So to give them some credit, when nothing is happening, they usually get it right. So they said nothing is happening in Kherson, Odessa, nothing is happening in Zaporizhia, apart from shelling and things, but the fronts aren't moving. And yeah, they're right. However, the big difference in fact selection, prioritization, and narrative comes when we talk about highly active conflict zones, where territory is indeed changing hands. For our purposes today, that's Kharkiv and East Donbass. And it's been this distinction between the two sides for the last week and probably a few weeks more. So the Ukrainians have gained territory near Kharkiv and they've lost territory in East Donbass. So the West-leaning reports prioritize the Kharkiv events, right? They put them front and center. They build the whole story of the war around them, as Germany did, and they make sure you know Kharkiv is really important. They don't focus so much on East Donbass, saying things like, Russian gains in East Donbass don't really affect Ukrainian strategic thinking. So this from May 5th, another OSINT channel. The next one there. Yeah. Anyway, those reports characterized the second phase of Russia's invasion as a failed blitzkrieg, the same operational strategy, it appears, as the first 5 weeks of the war up to the withdrawal from Kiev. The most common word describing Russia's East Donbass campaign is stalled, but I think this is actually a complete misreading of Russia's Phase 2 campaign. I've dug out this briefing from Rusi here to demonstrate the following point. Before the invasion, every analyst and his dog was looking at the artillery-heavy composition and doctrine of the Russian army, and therefore expecting a war strategy based on long-range fire. So we'll quote from here quickly. The role of artillery in a war between Russia and Ukraine. Artillery is likely to play a prominent role in any conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Russia's predominance in self-propelled howitzers and ISTAR will prove decisive and may have strategic outcomes. A conflict between Russia and Ukraine would inevitably involve extensive use of tactical artillery on both sides. This was the case in 2015 when fighting was at its most intense and, despite the improvement in ground attack capabilities of the Russian Air Force, it is evident that much of Russia's lethality is retained by its artillery within the ground forces. The Russian army has been characterized as an artillery army with a lot of tanks. I mean, that seems like a fairly accurate assessment to me. So the Phase 1 part of Russia's offensive, which was an ineffective and costly bum rush across the north of Ukraine, if you're to be uncharitable, that came as a surprise as opposed to this strategy. And it didn't work out for the Russians. It seems to me that the Russians have reverted to their normal and expected strategy in East Donbass, relying on their large superiority in artillery, air power, and missile strikes to conduct a slow and grinding advance. And we also have some, if you go to the next one, so Rory has recently written an article about the Taiwan question and likely scenarios for a Chinese invasion over on lotuseaters.com if you want more information on that. But going back to Ukraine and Russia, the Russian-leaning narratives invert the Western approach by de-emphasizing Kharkiv and emphasizing East Donbass. They argue that the skirmishes around Kharkiv are a sideshow and the Ukrainian gains here are insignificant and not hotly contested by the defending Russian forces. Whereas East Donbass, the region whose 8-year proxy conflict built up to this war, is the real prize, and that's where Russia is making gains. So this from a privated Russian-leaning Twitter account. This whole Ukrainian Kharkov operation has massive Snake Island vibes, a militarily pointless but heavily committed attack against secondary targets that achieves surprise only because of how boneheaded it is, and which ends in disaster when the Russians actually respond. In other news, the Ukrainians are claiming they're mopping up the company or so of Russian troops that crossed the Donetsk near Belohorivka without providing any evidence. So that's where the arrow is there, the crossing. Meaning the Russians are probably pouring troops across right now, getting Hostomel vibes. Now, let's not forget that Russia has just captured a major fortified town, Popasna, which you can see there, the little bulge on the eastern side, that had been subject to heavy fighting for weeks. That's a significant achievement. There's a lot of fortifications behind the lines that aren't in cities as well, but there we go. Let's have a look at this map. So between these two narratives, it seems like the war on the ground will be decided by the actual losses and the fighting state of the units there, something which is heavily shrouded in the fog of war. West-leaning accounts are predicting a Russian collapse around Kharkiv, while Russian-leaning accounts are predicting encirclements of Ukrainian units in this cauldron of East Donbass. I think a collapse on either side will come as a surprise, quite frankly, and we can look forward to a bloody, grinding, drawn-out war over the next few months.
I have no idea what to say, of course, because I don't keep up with it, but if that's going to be the future, I guess so.
And this is the overall picture as far as we can ascertain, according to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in Ukraine today. So as you can see, Russia still maintains all of the territory that it took in the south in that first phase of the campaign, and most of the intense fighting is happening up there in the upper corner of East Donbass.
If you appreciated that segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the content we have on the site, such as John's series on poetry, this one, the Tennyson collection. And if you want to follow what else John is doing, you can follow him on Getter at @John Wheatley on Getter. Thank you and goodbye.